The rain hadn't let up since dawn, a relentless weeping from the sky that seemed to mirror the heavy ache in my chest. By the time we stepped out of St. Matthew's Church, the gray Charleston sky felt like a shroud, clinging to my very bones. Silas Beaumont had been more than my grandfather. He was the bedrock in a life too often buffeted by sharp words and colder silences. The service itself was a muted affair, dignified and filled with the faces of a community he'd quietly uplifted for decades. My father, Caleb, stood front and center, accepting condolences with the practiced smile of a seasoned politician. His handshakes were firm, his gaze measured, and I briefly hoped that perhaps, for once, grief had softened the hard edges of his ambition. That hope, thin as spun glass, shattered quickly. Hours later, the mourners gone, the scent of damp flowers still heavy and cloying in the estate's drawing room, I found myself nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. My gaze drifted to the old oak mantel, a silent witness to countless evenings where Silas would rest his arm there, weaving tales of resilience and foresight. It was a space filled with ghost echoes of his gentle laughter. Caleb walked in, his expression stripped bare of the polite mask he'd worn all day, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "It's done," he stated flatly, his voice devoid of any warmth. "The estate transfer is official. $400 million locked in my name." He said it like a man announcing the weather, then allowed a thin, venomous smirk to curl his mouth. I nodded slowly, unsure what he expected me to say, or even if he cared. He didn't give me the chance. "You're useless now." The words hung in the air, too absurd to register at first. "Excuse me. You've coasted long enough, Lyra," he said, his tone cutting clean through the stale air. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house by morning." For a moment, I couldn't feel my hands, a strange numbness creeping up my arms. This was Caleb, my father, the man who'd once taught me to ride a bicycle, who'd lectured me endlessly about ambition, now looking at me like I was a piece of unwanted furniture. I stood, forcing my spine straight, even as my chest tightened with a searing cold. "Fine," I managed, the word emerging without a tremor. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a broken voice. I walked out of the room, the hollow echo of my footsteps following me down the long hall toward the bedroom that had never truly felt like mine. I grew up in a house where silence was a form of control, where every breath felt measured. Caleb's rules were precise and absolute. No slammed doors, no talking back, and never, under any circumstance, challenge his decisions. My earliest memories of him are measured in corrections, posture too slouched, tone too sharp, ambitions too unrealistic. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to keep my victories to myself. If I brought home an A, he'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he'd wonder aloud how many other kids hadn't bothered to compete. Praise was a rare, almost mythical creature, and when it did appear, it felt more like a reluctant footnote than a genuine celebration. Silas was different. My grandfather's presence was like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight after being indoors too long. He didn't push me to be perfect. He simply asked me what I wanted, and then he listened, truly listened, to the answer. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to work in finance, to understand the intricate currents that moved money and power. Caleb scoffed, dismissing it as a man's world. Silas just smiled, his eyes twinkling, and told me to learn everything you can, Lyra. Knowledge is your strongest currency. Years later, when I was accepted into a highly competitive graduate program, Caleb dismissed it as a waste of time and money. I remember sitting on the porch with Silas that night, my acceptance letter in my lap, wondering if I should turn it down. He sipped his sweet tea, then quietly slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check, large enough to cover my tuition for the first year. "Don't tell him," Silas had said, his voice a quiet murmur. "This is between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That was Silas, believing in me when it cost him something real. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom with a half-packed suitcase, I thought of that night and the quiet pride in his eyes. Caleb could strip me of this house, this material shell, but he couldn't erase the foundation Silas had given me. As I reached for another hanger, something hard shifted inside the lining of my old bookshelf, not the house itself, but a shelf I'd kept near my bed since childhood. The house no longer felt like mine, not truly. Within days of the funeral, The warmth Silas had infused into the estate seemed to evaporate, replaced by something sharper, colder. Doors that had always been left open were now locked. The sprawling library, the sunroom, even the small study where Silas kept his records, each handle rattled uselessly when I tried it. The staff, people I'd known for years, avoided my eyes. Margaret, the housekeeper who used to sneak me scones from the kitchen, now gave only curt nods, her hands perpetually busy with tasks that didn't quite need doing. When I asked if something was wrong, she murmured, "Mr. Beaumont's instructions," before hurrying away. At dinner, Caleb spoke as if I weren't even there. He discussed moving forward, with an air of absolute finality, talking about renovations, new investments, and streamlining the household, in ways that made it abundantly clear I wasn't part of his plans. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone cutting away what he considered dead weight. Back in my room, I tried to focus on packing. My fingers skimmed along the spines of books I'd kept since high school, old friends who had provided comfort in a time when I'd needed safe places to hide my thoughts. 1. A thick biography of a pioneering female financier that Silas had given me on my 18th birthday slid forward more easily than the others. When I pulled it free, something small and firm shifted inside. I flipped it open and found a sealed envelope tucked deep between the last few pages. My name, in Silas's steady, familiar hand, stood out against the cream paper. I sat on the edge of the bed, tearing the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a single piece of stationery, the ink faint but deliberate. "The will protects those who protect others." No explanation, no context, just that one line, weighted enough to stop me cold. I read it again, tracing the words as if more meaning might appear, a hidden message in the elegant script. Silas had hidden it for me to find. Not Caleb, not anyone else. I folded the note back into the envelope and slid it into my bag, my mind already turning over what it could possibly mean. Caleb's study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, the same as it had when Silas used it, only now the warmth was gone, replaced by a brittle chill. Caleb sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, leaning back in Silas's old chair as though it had always belonged to him. A crystal tumbler of bourbon rested at his elbow, half full, catching the faint light from the desk lamp. "Sit," he commanded, not looking up from the papers in front of him. I didn't move until he finally raised his eyes, a faint, condescending smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you've heard," he began, as though the whole city wasn't already buzzing with the news. 400 million. All mine. Silas was generous. His voice carried no trace of grief, only the smug satisfaction of someone who just won a game they'd stacked in their favor. I stayed quiet, letting him fill the air with his self-congratulation. "You've had a long, comfortable stay here, Lyra," he continued, his tone shifting to something colder, sharper. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And frankly, you've been coasting." He said it like a verdict, not an opinion. I almost laughed. I'd been working since I was 16, paying my own way through most of grad school thanks to Silas, not him. But arguing now would be like shouting into the wind. "I want you out by morning," he said, leaning forward, elbows on the desk. "No drama, no drawn-out goodbyes. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here." His gaze lingered on me, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the desperate protest. I felt the weight of Silas's note in my pocket, the words burning, a strange heat, against my leg. "The will protects those who protect others." I straightened my shoulders. "Fine." No tremor in my voice. No hesitation. I rose, turned, and walked out without another word. Upstairs, I finished packing the last of my clothes into the worn leather suitcase Silas had given me years ago. The envelope stayed in my coat pocket, as if moving it might weaken whatever strength it had given me in that room. By the time the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9, my bags were by the door. I didn't look back when I stepped outside into the cool Charleston night, the rain now a mere drizzle. By the next afternoon, I was hauling my suitcase up the narrow staircase of a brick walk-up in downtown Charleston. The apartment was barely big enough for me to stretch my arms without touching both walls, but it was mine. No locked doors, no eyes watching to see if I measured up. I'd sold a few pieces of jewelry Caleb had given me over the years, gifts more for show than sentiment. The cash wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the deposit and my first month's rent. My job as a financial analyst allowed me to work remotely, so I set up my laptop on the little kitchen table and kept my hours steady, forcing a semblance of normalcy into the chaos. Still, at night, I'd catch myself pulling the envelope from my coat pocket, rereading Silas's enigmatic words, "The will protects those who protect others." It didn't sound like something he'd say casually, and it certainly didn't sound like a message meant for Caleb. I started digging quietly. Public records, probate filings, even old news articles about estates with unusual clauses. Most of it was noise, but every so often I'd find something that made my pulse jump. Trusts that released funds only under specific conditions, wills tied to joint ventures or community projects. Silas had been meticulous in everything he did. It was possible, maybe even likely, that his will carry the same precision. 3 days after I moved in, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something, a prickle of intuition, made me swipe to answer. Lyra Beaumont. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undercurrent of dry amusement. Yes, this is she. This is Alara Vance. I was your grandfather's attorney. A pause, deliberate. We should talk about his will. It's unusual. There was a flicker of satisfaction in her tone, like she was holding back from saying more until we were face to face. I sat up straighter. How unusual. She gave a short, knowing laugh. Let's just say your father's week is about to get a lot more complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow? I glanced at the envelope on the table, my mind already racing ahead. Yes, I said, a new kind of anticipation unfurling in my gut. I can. Alara Vance's office was nothing like I expected. No polished mahogany or antique rugs, just clean lines, muted colors, and a wall of neatly labeled files. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, then folded her hands, studying me with the kind of look that said she already knew more than she was letting on. I've been waiting for you to call, she began, her gaze unwavering. Your grandfather anticipated certain dynamics in this family. I arched a brow. Meaning my father? Meaning exactly your father, she said, pulling a thick binder toward her. Silas placed his entire estate, everything, in a trust. Caleb cannot access a single cent of the $400 million unless specific conditions are met. I leaned forward, pulse quickening. What conditions? Her lips curved slightly, like she'd been waiting for that question. He must complete a significant community redevelopment project that meets city approval and Arthur's philanthropic standards. And he must do it with you as co-executive. Equal authority, equal signature rights. I sat back, trying to process. You're saying he can't do it without me? Correct. There's more, she continued, flipping a page. During the 12 months it takes to complete the project, there can be no lawsuits between you and Caleb, no public estrangement, and no formal withdrawal from the arrangement by either party. Any violation, and the trust dissolves and the money. Alara flipped to the final page of the clause. Half would go to the charities Silas named, the other half directly to you. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I thought about Caleb in his study, smug and certain he'd already won. I thought about him telling me I was useless, a financial burden. Silas truly planned this. He wanted to ensure the person he trusted most was in a position to protect his legacy, Alara said, her voice soft but firm. And that person wasn't your father. I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk. A slow, deliberate motion as a cold, steady fire ignited within me. When does Caleb find out? Alara's smile widened just slightly. He already has. I felt the shift in my chest, a quiet anticipation settling in. Then, I suppose I should be expecting a knock at my door. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after leaving Alara's office, there was a sharp, impatient knock on my apartment door. When I opened it, Caleb stood there, expensively dressed, but the edges of his usual composure frayed. His face was pale, a faint sheen of sweat along his hairline. Lyra, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thought we should talk. Family to family. I stepped aside without a word, letting him into the cramped living room. He glanced around, eyes lingering on the second-hand furniture like it was a personal insult. The bank tells me there's been a misunderstanding, he began, settling onto the sofa, which creaked under his weight. Funds are tied up in some sort of trust. Ridiculous red tape. His tone was light, but I could hear the desperate strain under it. It's not a misunderstanding, I said, my voice even. It's the will. He waved a dismissive hand. Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can work around it. He leaned forward, softening his voice, trying for a conspiratorial tone. You and I, Lyra. Blood is blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Make this work for both of us. Silas's words flickered in my mind. Don't react. Negotiate. What exactly are you proposing? I asked evenly. That you sign whatever is needed, so I can move forward. You'll get something, of course. I held his gaze. That's not how it's written. His forced smile thinned to a grim line. Lyra, I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both. The threat was there, coiled under the words, a familiar venom. But I didn't flinch. If you want the money, I said, my voice steady, you'll follow the terms. All of them. A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, I thought he might explode, but instead he stood, straightening his jacket with a jerking motion. Think about it, he said, then walked out without another glance. I closed the door behind him, already knowing I wouldn't need to. He'd be back. 2 days after our first meeting, I had the agreement ready. Elara had helped me refine it, each clause crafted with the same meticulous precision Silas had used in his will. Caleb would publicly acknowledge me as co-executive, cover my living costs for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific estate properties into my name. Outright. No conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across Elara's conference table, Caleb's eyes skimmed it, then flicked up to me, his face pale. You can't be serious. Every word, I said. He leaned back, crossing his arms. I'm not signing this. You're extorting me. I didn't blink. The will is extorting you. I'm just giving you a way forward. For the next week, he stalled, claimed he was busy with other matters, sent back pages with red ink scrawled across the margins. He even consulted another lawyer, a sharp-suited man who lasted 1 meeting before quietly confirming the truth. Silas's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, Caleb's $400 million might as well have been buried in the ground. When he finally returned to Elara's office, he was quieter. Not defeated, exactly, but there was a weight in his posture, a tightness around his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Elara notarized it, her expression neutral, though I caught the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Caleb pushed the signed packet toward me, his knuckles white. I hope you know what you're doing, Lyra. I do, I said, tucking the agreement into my folder. We stood, the air between us heavy with everything unspoken. He left without shaking my hand, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift, not just in paperwork, but in power, and it was only the beginning. The waterfront lot had been little more than a patch of cracked asphalt and weeds when we began. Silas's plans call for something alive, glass walls opening to the harbor, classrooms for job training, and vibrant space for local markets on weekends. From the first week, I made it my business to know every detail. I walked the site with the contractors each morning, reviewed invoices at night, and built relationships with the city officials whose signatures we needed. The more I showed up, the more the crews looked to me for decisions. Caleb hated it. He showed up late to meetings, floated ideas to trim the budget that ignored both building code and Silas's vision. Whenever I refused, he muttered about me being impossible to work with. But he never tried to shut me out. He couldn't. The will made sure of that. The press, of course, loved the story. Beaumont family unites to honor patriarch's dream. They photographed us side by side, smiling for the cameras. In the glossy spreads, we looked like a united team. Behind those smiles, however, every conversation was a negotiation, every shared glance a battle of wills. By month 11, the center's steel frame was complete, glass panels catching the morning sun like a promise. Caleb stood with me on the balcony overlooking the water, watching crews set the final supports. You've handled yourself better than I expected, he said, the words clipped but carrying a grudging note of genuine observation. Better than you wanted, perhaps, I replied, a small smile playing on my lips. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Perhaps. It wasn't trust. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was an acknowledgement, however brittle, that I wasn't the liability he'd painted me to be. And in a few weeks, the project would be finished and the will's conditions met. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd large enough to spill onto the sidewalks. City leaders, reporters, and families from the neighborhood gathered under a bright spring sun, the new community center gleaming behind us. Caleb stood to my left, hands clasped, smile practiced for the cameras. He was the figurehead, but the speeches weren't his to give. That was Silas's stipulation and mine. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium. I spoke about Silas's profound belief that wealth meant little if it didn't lift others. I thanked the contractors, the volunteers, and the community who'd worked alongside us. I didn't mention Caleb. The applause started slow, then built into something steady and warm, rolling over the courtyard. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Caleb's expression tighten, his jaws set, as the focus stayed undeniably on me. By the end of the day, the trust conditions were fulfilled. Caleb would have his fortune. I had something different. 3 prime estate properties in my name, and the public credit for bringing Silas's vision to life. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away down the side path, my heels clicking against the new brickwork. The center stood behind me, alive with voices, exactly as Silas had imagined. I didn't look back at Caleb. I didn't need to. I'd taken the part of my family's legacy worth keeping and left the rest in the past.